Okay, I think I'm recording. So, welcome, and we're going to go over a few things. Where's my, let's see. Okay, so everybody sees my outline there? Okay, great. So as we get started, let me ask, because I asked y'all to take a look at some of those videos and websites on talk about curriculum. Does anyone have a question about that, or did they learn anything about curriculum? What's may have any changed your view, or what's your thoughts on curriculum? Emily, you got to unmute. How's that?
I got it. Sorry.
Okay.
I didn't realize that in order to plan out a curriculum that most people start with these 4 steps, or there's 4 types of curriculums actually, excuse me. I thought that was really interesting. I guess from a teacher's perspective, we're pretty much told what curriculum to use. I didn't realize all the processes that went into developing a curriculum.
Right. So there's, to break it down simpler, and when you read Aoki, he kind of lays it out this way. I mean, there's the curriculum that is planned, and that's whether it's the district planning or the teacher planning, and then there's the curriculum that is taught. Okay, so, and there are...
And then there's also the tested curriculum, right?
Well, yeah, and that's part of the, I think I would put that in with the plan.
Got it.
Because the plan now is geared to the test. So right. Despite what experts or certain people might say, the test is very much the curriculum. So keep in mind. So everything that y'all took a look at had to do with the school, what we call in the curriculum field, the school curriculum. Okay, so the school curriculum is everything that occurs in and around school. So from the time a student, I should say, gets on the bus, or even reaches the bus stop, or is traveling to school in whatever form, on a car or public bus, or walking or riding a bike. That's part of the school curriculum, and then everything through the day, including extracurricular and obviously homework, even once they get home. So that's the school curriculum. But those of us who theorize about curriculum recognize that there's another curriculum, and that is the culture itself. Everything that's going on outside of school that ultimately will have some impact on the school. And there's a symbiotic relationship between school and the outside world. So each influences the other. Okay. So curriculum can be a much broader area to think about. If some of y'all remember after Katrina, we had a lot of curriculum developed around Katrina based upon like the film when the levees broke and these types of things. So we can argue that Katrina was very much part of the curriculum. So, but it's not just events. It can be the everyday and how communities operate, and how the communities interact with the school and society generally. I think one of the things we, in the way we organize schools today versus, 50, 60 years ago, when I was a young kid, I'm 67, by the way. The school and the community were very close to one another because I did go to Catholic school, but everybody in my neighborhood or everybody in that broad church parish that I lived in, went to that school. But even for the public school, essentially the public school covered the same exact area. Okay, so there was much closer community ties. Now I think we have less community and more association. Okay, because the schools are not necessarily in the community, and that's particularly true as we go up in age group and grade. Elementary schools can be more tied to a community, except in places like Baton Rouge where you may have more dramatic busing and that type of stuff. So that's, and that's the basic idea around curriculum that we usually understand. I have my simple description of curriculum that I kind of work with is curriculum is I should say curricula are the stories that we as a community or society decide to tell our children about who we are. Okay, so it's just like, when you're a parent, you'll tell certain stories to your toddlers and other stories to your kids as they get older and in pre-adolescent, stories as adolescents, then as they become adults. My mom's 89 years old, and she suddenly is starting telling me stories about her life as a teenage girl growing up in New Orleans in the 1940s. And I never thought my mother was as bad a youngster as she was. So it's kind of interesting, and then there's some stories we will probably never tell our kids, right? So about our lives. And I think society operates in many of the same ways. So that's another way to think about that. So I on B, letter B, whatever, kind of have curriculum broken apart. So curriculum is really a Latin word. It has two parts. Chiari, and a lot of curriculum theorists that I work with talk a lot about currere, which basically means race course. It's the root for circus as well. So a curriculum in the Roman world was think of it as a kind of short track that would be out in the provinces. It's not the big, it's not the Ben-Hur chariot track that we see in the movie. That's a circus. So it's because culum, the second part of the word, is a diminutive suffix. Okay, so it's a Latin word used to make things smaller, to describe things as being something smaller than an original. And so that is where, so we get the idea of curriculum as a kind of race course. You will, I talk a little bit about that in the Harvey piece, some of those origins coming out of Peter Ramus. Um, and those in 504 will get more, or if you had 504, you'll remember the quest for method, or you will take 504 if you're not yet, and you'll read that piece, I'm assuming. So so this is something I've worked on. The so curriculum is often described, particularly in the late medieval or really early modern literature, as a shortcut. It's as a way to think about school in its most efficient sense. So, the drive to efficiency that we see today really originates with the evolution of curriculum as a way to describe schools. Okay, and I can go through that a little bit in Harvey. So what's important about curriculum from a broad social historical perspective is that the concept of curriculum has been a driver of Western civilization. It is an important step in the move out of the late medieval period into the modern period, which occurs really at the end of the 15th and into the 16th century, and becomes fairly full-blown by the end of the 16th and into the 17th century. And what's interesting is it also parallels the period where Western Europe, particularly, and we'll place the colonial America in that as well, is moving from a predominantly oral society into a literate society. So literacy is not defined merely as reading and writing in the literature. And the author that I paid a lot of attention to, that's written extensively about this, is a guy he's been passed away for about 20 years, by the name of Walter Ong, and he's written extensively about literacy, and has written extensively about Peter Ramus. So so literacy is tied, the way we understand literacy today is tied to the printed text, not the written text. Because when you had monks copying books, right, in the scriptorium, you couldn't produce enough books over time to spread them, across the population. And that's one of the reasons why, a lot of Europeans, or most Europeans, didn't know how to read and write. The printed text changes that, which occurs, we all know about Gutenberg. So again, this is a 15th century invention. But what really drives literacy is the university and the ability to print textbooks in Latin that can then be used across the entire areas of Europe, particularly that, engage in Latin learning. So the area is not dominated by the Greeks or the Russians, okay? But so, which would have been Eastern Europe and Southeastern Europe. So that's what really drives literacy. And literacy, in that sense, changes how we do schooling in a number of different ways. And I would argue that full literacy doesn't come into being until after the First World War, because it's during the First World War that we developed pulp paper, right? So all these paper mills in Louisiana that stink up the skies. Pulp paper, which is a cheap way to produce paper, a lot cheaper than using linen or cotton. Okay. Prior to that, paper was made from fabrics, from fabric fibers, cotton, usually cotton or linen, and was rather expensive, even in the beginnings of printing. So what's interesting is if you find a very old book, and when I had live classes, I could pass around books to show the whole idea. Students learned quickly to write in their own books because they couldn't afford paper to write notes that way. Okay, so the whole idea of annotation and marginalia evolves because there isn't enough paper to go around, nor can people afford it. Okay. The other thing that's important is the idea of method, also developed by Peter Ramus, as well as the concept of curriculum. So method and curriculum go hand in hand. So we can understand curriculum as a method of schooling, and I present that at the beginning of the Harvey piece, with the big quote from Quintellan, that's utilized in those pieces written by Peter Ramus that Harvey is drawing upon for his own lecture here that we've read. Okay. Any questions on curriculum at this point? Okay. So we have some interesting characters. We have Harvey, Gabriel Harvey, who is he's an arts master in rhetoric at Cambridge. I talk about him a little bit. And the piece that you've read is Harvey's Rhetor, which is a 2-day, basically it's a 2-day lecture that was given at the commencement of a Cambridge school year. And he's basically talking about what makes a good speaker, a good rhetorician. So a rhetor is a person, how to be a good orator, we would say today. And he bases a lot of his ideas on Cicero, who is the late Republic, fairly significant late Republic scholar and lawyer, who runs afoul of the government and is exiled to Dacia, which is present-day Romania, which is where he dies. But Cicero, why Cicero is important, is in the Middle Ages, Cicero is understood to be the key model of what a good student should learn. So so it's Cicero's academic life that really becomes the first curriculum in that sense. And so the assumption is, you can see from Harvey, but you also see in the quote from Quintellan at the beginning of the paper. So a rhetorician, well, whether you're a an orator, or whether you're a lawyer, or whether you're a teacher, okay, you should have a kind of encyclopedic knowledge of the world. So you should know a lot about stuff, okay, which, we've kind of, I think in some ways we've moved away from. I think y'all would hate this idea, but I think everyone would be better served with an even broader knowledge of the world of intellectual concepts, and that way, as you taught, you could teach more broadly. But that's a personal view. The reason we seem to have moved away from that is because of Peter Ramus, because for him, he is the person that decides that school should take as little time as necessary, and that things should be broken into specific subjects. Now, for him, those subjects were Latin grammar, Latin rhetoric, and Latin dialectic or logic. Okay. So, but Ramus would eventually also dabble in mathematics. Although it was my major professor, who was Bill Dahl, who you'll read in the next article, as he looked at some of Ramus's mathematics, he wasn't very good at it. So, but we think he moved to mathematics so we wouldn't be harassed by other arts masters either in the quadrivium or the trivium or the quadrivium. Okay. And then we have the Puritans who saw Ramus, and I'm talking about both the English and the New England Puritans, but particularly the New England Puritans, that saw Ramus as a kind of intellectual hero. They understood him to be a martyr because Ramus was killed during the St. Bartholomew Day massacre, in which Catholics ran amok in Paris, killing all of the Protestants they could find. We think, scholars think that Ramus was not killed for that reason, but his intellectual enemies got to him during that chaos and did him in. And the pro-Ramus and anti-Ramus forces would go at each other, for the next century or so, until Ramus started becoming a bit passé, and universities began to move on to other types of logics that would be developed in the 17th century. So Harvey begins to talk about the rhetor, and the rhetor is broken into 3 parts. On the first day, he talks about 2 of the threefold tools, and the second day he talks about the third. So, it's the way of thinking about the curriculum using the threefold tool that is really different about this piece. It's a way to rethink the curriculum, not as broad structures, as maps, as pacing guides and standards, or even the test in itself, because from the understanding of the threefold tool, the test should never come first, because the test should always be based upon what it is the student is coming from. Okay, so, and those of you, and so this is a fairly common theme. I talked about this yesterday in the lecture I did on Plutarch. But the threefold tool for Harvey is nature, okay, art, and exercise. Okay, so what is nature? So nature is not purely physiology as we would think about it today. It's not what God gives you. It is both that and your upbringing. So nature is not, it's a combination of nature and nurture as we understand it, but it doesn't include school. Okay. It is how you were raised in your family. It's how you're raised before you get to school. It's those experiences. I argue it's largely about language acquisition. Ramus talks about aspects of nature using the concept of a natural dialectic. So it's kind of, which would be understood as natural reasoning, which is what a child does. You know, if you think about a toddler exploring on his hands and knees or her hands and knees, you know, the living room for the first time, or if you take them outside going through the grass, and as they touch things and they stop, as they come upon things, they grab and of course put them in their, they put that thing in their mouth, you know, and look at it. Okay, you can understand that as a kind of natural induction, logical induction, in which they're generalizing about the world through that hands-on experience. Okay. With older kids, we see that I always like, and I talk about in my dissertation, when a child gets to play with a cardboard box, right? You bought a washing machine, you put the box in the backyard, and the kids go play with it. And they create all this imaginative world around the box. Most of us have done that. So there's a kind of natural dialectic at work. I would say playing with the boxes is a kind of important practice for young children before they get to school. So that's all part of nature. You can include the extended family. You also see the way in which young children play with sounds, play with words, you know, what we call baby talk, and the way they talk about things as they begin to work through their language acquisition. And all of this is a kind of natural dialectic in which they're generalizing about how we respond to their use of words, and how they put them together, because they see us as adults reacting to each other in that same way. Okay. So that's all part of nature. The second is art, and this is not to be understood as we understand fine arts. This isn't about painting and drawing or sculpture, or even not even really the novel, you know, literature in a fanciful way. This is art, and this is why we always would get confused in school about arts and sciences, right? Art in this concept is the structure of a discipline, the structure of a subject. So you have, again, in the trivium, in the 7 liberal arts through the Middle Ages, the art of Latin grammar, the art of Latin rhetoric, which is what Harvey is talking about in the art of Latin logic or dialectic, which is how to analyze text. Okay, that is what art is. And I have in there next to art method, because Ramus moves from that broader notion of art to method, okay, in his work on reforming the art of dialectic. So method is a shortcut for a discipline, for an art, okay, and a way to teach that in an efficient way, okay. So that's the connection. Why in the where method evolves, as we understand it, is from Peter Ramus. Okay, so the third, so art is everything that happens in school. Okay, it is the structure of the classroom, if you will. That is where you learn the things you need to learn to reason through the world, so that when you graduate, you can utilize those strategies, those reasoning strategies that you learn by reading texts on the world itself. That is exercise, applying what you learn in school to your everyday life, okay? Because the whole point of going to school is to learn how to live a better life, okay? It's, and so I have exercise and experience. Experience is a good teacher, but it's an even better teacher if you can apply the art of reasoning through that process. Okay. So originally, art was unable to teach everything to the student that a student needed, particularly in a Ramus world, in a Ramus classroom. But art did teach how good action, okay? And this idea in the Greek phrase for that is eupraxia. So you see in eupraxia that evil word we all learn about called praxis. But Harvey is not referring to a test. They stole it from the Greeks, okay? So what praxis means for the Greeks, and then for the Middle Ages, is thoughtful action, okay? So good action is thoughtful action, using what you learn in school, okay? And so one of the overarching ideas about what it takes to be a good rhetor is not unlike that which it takes to be a good teacher. And so one could describe good teaching as good action. Okay? So, kind of hold that thought. We'll get back to it. So exercise is broken down into two processes. The first process is analysis, and this is one aspect of the art of dialectic, in which the metaphor that Harvey uses, I'm sorry, straight out of the Greek classics, comes from Odysseus. Odysseus's wife was Penelope, and while Odysseus was trying to find his way home, if you ever read the story, if you remember the story, Penelope is trying to fend off suitors because they all think Odysseus is dead. So Penelope told the suitors, when I finish weaving my rug, okay, then I will choose a suitor. But what she would do at night is unravel her rug, unravel her web. And so think of analysis as a process of unraveling. Of course, Penelope never finishes her rug, and Odysseus shows up, and he gets his bow and arrow, and he shoots all the suitors dead. Anyway, so that gives you a sense of where analysis might lead sometimes. So analysis is the evidence of, it can be evidence from the text, but it can also be evidence from observation and experience. In fact, the two should really work hand in hand. Okay, so there's a sense of reflection. For the beginning of the for the end of the 16th century, beginning of the 17th, we can see this as a kind of new empiricism. Francis Bacon writes about this, and he comes originally out of a Ramus framework, and it is very likely that Francis Bacon listened to Harvey's lecture at Cambridge, since Bacon was a freshman at the time and just entering Cambridge at the time of Harvey's lecture. Interesting things running together. Okay. The second part of exercise is Genesis. Okay, so you unravel the web, you have all these strands of thought, of argument that you're going to reconstruct into an essay, into a speech. Okay, so we can think of Harvey's day primarily as an oral presentation. Within a generation, that oral presentation becomes a written essay. Okay, so for those of you in English education, as you teach essay writing, right, to your students, I guess the upper level students, in the process of that, where you find a topic and then you begin to find evidence, and then you organize that evidence and put things on little note cards and move those note cards around and come up with a discourse, an essay that you're going to write about. You're actually engaging in Ramus's method. You're engaging in exercise. This is what you're doing. So you're still engaged in what essentially is a late medieval teaching method. Never thought of that. Okay. But Genesis is more than synthesis. All right. We would today probably talk about, and we look at Bloom's taxonomy, and we get analysis and we get synthesis, at least the old one. I think there's a new one. I can't ever keep up with that stuff. But Genesis is more than synthesis, because there's understood to be some type of creative spark. You're writing something new. Okay. So this is what, teachers and particularly university faculty are supposed to be doing. Knowledge creation, not just knowledge regurgitation. Okay. And so you see a lot in the Harvey piece where he's speaking against what he calls parroting. Okay. This is regurgitation. This is not what he's talking about. So it's not just about memorizing a bunch of words and then giving it back to the teacher. Okay. There's got to be some creative act, some sort of, verbal construction for there to be Genesis. And what's interesting is, we'll move to Dewey in a second. Dewey has a paper called the art reflex, which is a way of thinking about thinking, essentially. It's kind of a new psychology that he wrote in the early part of the 20th century, but he is drawing upon analysis and genesis. He talks about the learning process as a reflex arc, in which you have to do something with the analysis. You can memorize a bunch of words, memorize a bunch of ideas, but you got to do something with it. You got to be constructive and creative with those concepts. And that's learning. Learning is a two-part process. It's not just merely memorizing. Okay. So that's where that goes. And we kind of know that. And the kind of active learning strategies that we try to use in our classrooms when we have the time are all based upon these ideas. Now, we've forgotten where they come from, right? In part because we've psychologized all this. So the rise of psychology as a discipline is one of the reasons we've lost this discourse that Harvey's talking about. But up until, as long as Latin learning, as long as the use of Latin was important to learning, which goes into through the 18th century and into the 19th century, begins to change, in the middle part of the 19th century. These ideas continue to be important, although new ways of thinking have already come about that come into this. Okay. So Harvey talks about method as a kind of royal road. Now, this is an early understanding of method. So it's a way, it's a way through the forest of knowledge, to hold on to the metaphors, so that the student doesn't have to hack through everything on their own. Okay. My point is that the current curriculum, now, I began working on this over 10 years ago, but the current curriculum is not a royal road, okay? Because there's nowhere for the student to get off or the teacher to get off and explore things, okay? Explore the meadow or the hill or the stream, okay? I argue that it's a kind of cul-de-sac. It's a dead end, because what we hear about what good teaching is they use the concept of effective teaching. Well, what makes teaching effective? So what makes teaching effective is the test itself. So you're an effective teacher if your students pass the test. And if your students don't pass the test, then you're not an effective teacher. So that's why I call it a cul-de-sac. Okay. So I add in some modern connections. These are authors that some of whom you may be familiar with, some of whom you will become more familiar with. There's certainly, I talk about John Dewey and The Child in the Curriculum, and it showed the connections with that. There's Whitehead's Rhythm of Education. You will get more of that in the Dahl piece. Dahl will speak of this. You will get Dahl. You won't get his 4 R's, but you will get, let's say, some more advanced ideas, because the whole point of his 4 R's is to avoid inert ideas, which he draws from Whitehead on. Okay. And so Dahl's piece is called Keeping Knowledge Alive. And with Dahl, so with Whitehead, I argue that the rhythm repeats on, let's say, on an annual basis. So as a student moves from one grade level to the next. All right, so that, and so we think of the threefold tool in a similar way. If we see the notion of threes, the concept of threes at work here. So romance being somewhat like nature, precision being somewhat like art, and then generalization as exercise. Okay. For Dahl, he throws them in different combination, and he uses the concepts of richness, recursion, relations, and rigor. And Dahl had no idea about these concepts. He was quite amazed when I presented these ideas to him. In fact, when I first presented it at a conference, he was there. But his ideas are embedded with all the threefold tool. Okay. So when I talk, so at the conclusion, I talk about orthopractice and what orthodox practice. It's another way of talking about effective teaching. When you hear the concept of best practices, I'm afraid that's not open-ended enough to really be best practices, but it's orthodox practice. It's the way we expect you to teach, no matter who your students are. Best practices in its original form is you teach to your students. What are your students' needs? Not just what their interests are, because going back to Dewey is very adamant that it is incumbent upon the teacher to generate interest in the subjects. Okay, so it's not, you just don't surrender the idea of interest to the student. Okay, you could begin there, but then you have to move them to become interested in the curriculum itself, if you will. So orthopractice, effective practice is, Dahl would argue, is moving us towards the teaching of inert ideas. And we have to get away from that. And one of the things that, going back to the beginning of the Harvey piece, Harvey talks about novelty. And until I read that, I kind of, had an idea of that, but I didn't have a way to name it. But, you have to present students with novel ways of thinking. That draws their interest, right? And, not giving them the same old thing, which I'm afraid too much of the curriculum might be. I have a whole nother reading and a whole nother way to speak about that, but I will be sparing you that this summer. So I've gone through it. Questions? I hope.
Yes. Okay. Yes.
All right, Addie.
I'm gonna apologize ahead of time because I thought I took better notes, but in the reading it mentioned something about the romance of education. Am I wrong?
Right,
I didn't understand.
Whitehead.
What do you mean?
That's right, Whitehead.
Could you review that for
Well,
a moment, because that was one part that I'm stopping at.
Yeah. What is it in school that excited you as a student, as a young student? Don't say recess.
Don't put me on the spot like that. Probably the same reason why I'm here. A drive for competition, because
Well, but
girl,
for a subject area. What was your favorite subject in school?
I liked social studies. I liked.
Okay.
I liked all those big thoughts that were presented.
Okay. And you really enjoyed listening to the teacher talk about those things, right?
I did. I liked the lectures, and now they're teaching us don't do that anymore, and so I kind of feel like I was very different.
So you just described Whitehead's romance. Okay, your excitement for social studies, which was also my excitement, okay, that's your romance.
Okay, so it's passion for learning, just generally.
It's passion for learning.
Okay.
Very good. But it's a love, but it's also a love affair. So there's a Catholic saint, intellectual. She was martyred in Auschwitz, and she was a philosopher. And she writes and they wouldn't, because she was a woman in Germany in the even as early as the 1920s. She couldn't get a philosophy position at a university, so she taught at a girls' normal school, okay, run by the Dominicans anyway. And so she writes about teaching women's education. She went around Central Europe, predominantly Germany, Austria, a little bit of France, giving lectures on this. But for her, she would argue that the first act of teaching was love. And that one of the students' first act of learning, particularly for young children, is a love of the teacher. And those who teach young children get a sense of it. Perfect timing. So, but she argues that you need to, the teacher needs, and she talks about it in the form of eros, that initial love of student to teacher is a part of eros, which is one of the Greek concepts of love, right? We just talk about love. We don't have different words for love like the Greeks do. But she argues the teacher's responsibility is to quickly move the student from the love of the teacher to the love of content, to the love of the subject, okay? Because if you don't, then you might get yourself into trouble, as is too often in the news today. Okay. So romance then has that, for Whitehead, romance, I think, he doesn't talk about it in this way, but it has that that love aspect, that even erotic aspect to it. Although he's certainly not, he would never talk about it in those terms. But that's that passion that, Addie, you mentioned. And Dahl really seizes upon that. Dahl recognizes that precision is important, because eventually you've got to get the right answer. But don't teach precision too soon, because looking for the right answer all the time, well, will undermine the romance that the students have for that subject. Okay. And, you know, we get, you know, it was easy for me to fall in love with history and geography and even economics, believe it or not. But, you know, I knew there were a lot of my buddies in school that were never interested in that kind of stuff. And I could never understand why, right? Because all this is a story. It's fun, okay? And, you know, so math was hard. I never was excited about math. My interest in math came way too late. But if we think about even math from my perspective, if somebody would have taught me math this way, and I realized later this is kind of how I learn it. I mean, the way we teach, where's my math teachers here? The way we teach math is historical, right? So the first, if we think about the first use of math in numbers in Mesopotamia through cuneiform, this is about counting. Okay, and from counting, we moved into things like geometry. Okay, so the geometry came later with the Greeks and really the Egyptians. Okay, but there's also different aspects of the Sumerians as well. Of course, we still use some of Sumerian's number systems. The clock is a Sumerian, the 60 base 60 concepts around the clock is time is Sumerian. So, and then we moved eventually to algebra, which was basically developed by Descartes, right, in the 16th century. And then we get trig, not trig. Well, you get algebra. Well, algebra came earlier. I'm sorry. The Arabs kind of created algebra around the 8th and 9th century. Once they discovered the zero from the Hindus in India, and then Descartes invents trig to measure the way in which planets move and to measure, other mechanical things. And then out of that, we get calculus by both Newton and now I'm going to forget the name, Leibniz. They essentially create that about the same time. And then you move, then in the last 150 years, we get nonlinear mathematics. You get, Schrodinger developing the mechanics around measuring atoms, the atom. And he actually set out to prove that didn't exist. And he ended up with the mathematical models that proved it. Held up in a cabin in the Alps with his girlfriend. So, all this kind of interesting. See, that's the kind of stuff about math that interests me. So, anyway, and then generalization is what we do naturally, right? It's what the toddler does. So once we get an idea, a good idea about a concept, then we think about it in terms of the world around us. And then we get interested in, hopefully we get interested in something else. And that process that romance begins again. Okay. Does that help? Okay, Addie, thank you. Anybody else?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Like I alluded to earlier, for us that are a little older and haven't been in school for a little bit,
Yeah.
can you explain this gloss and
Oh,
what you're
thank
looking
you.
for?
I meant to do that. So think about it as a kind of critical summary or a reflective summary. So it's not, a gloss is not just summarizing what you see, but taking parts of it. You don't have to deal with all of it, but taking parts of it and discussing it from your own experience. So I often say, is there any part of the reading that speaks to you? Okay, and that's what I would focus on. Okay, so you're presenting me an argument, if you will. So you're reading, you're using an analysis, you're breaking it down into parts, into ideas. You're seeing those connections, and then you're going to create. You can present your own thoughts using Genesis, where you bring that together with your own experiences. or out of your own experiences. Now, those experiences can be practical or can be from something you read from another course. Okay. So the only time you need to cite something is if you refer to a book or a paper that's not part of the course. Then you need to give me a citation.
So we don't have to cite information from an article that we might have previously read from your course if we're connecting ideas
So
together.
if you're from another course, yeah, you kind of got to do that.
No, from your course. Like if I want to cite something from the first reading to this
And the
one.
second reading, right? All you need is say, in Harvey, it was this.
Okay.
You know, yeah, no citation. Right. Very good. That's correct.
Is there a rubric?
No.
Okay, all right.
So rubrics are part of the problem.
But how
There is a rubric for your final
how
project
I know that it's
in
perfect?
your vision. You do have
I was wondering the same thing.
but no, because without a rubric, now I get different ways of presentation. I got different ways of looking at your, it's one thing if you're middle school, but you're not. I want to see more original thoughts. How are you reacting to that? A rubric would sort of put everything the same. Okay. The curriculum project later is open-ended enough, and the rubric's really not. It's because the project's part of the assessment system, and it's very general, so it doesn't. Okay. Very good questions. Thank you, Jasper, I meant to talk about the gloss. Anyone else? Austin, you're thinking about it, right? Now you're scratching your head. Okay.
I'm sorry, guys. One more question about the reading itself. As I was reading it, it really seemed like it was concentrating just on informal education. Are they talking about like the whole curriculum inside the school, outside the school, or are they trying to specify more like an argument for like a Montessori method? Because
You're talking about Harvey? The Harvey reading?
Yeah, the whole article seemed like it was, these are all
No.
the different ways of curriculums, these are the positives and the negatives, but it seemed like it was concentrating on informal versus formal, and informal being good, like without saying the Montessori method. It kind of felt like the Montessori method.
I don't see the connection to the Montessori method. That's interesting. No one's ever said that.
My
It's
son does
really about
Montessori.
formal, right? Because he's talking about what a teacher needs to consider of the student, of their nature. And so once you learn about your student, and think of it, another way to think about it, at this time that Harvey's writing, we still don't have the traditional classroom. That's going to come in another generation or so. This is more of a sitting around the room education process. But so Harvey is espousing the idea that the teacher is a fellow traveler with the student through ideas. Okay, so there is, but it's all in a formal setting. Now, it wouldn't look like our classroom. Okay, it would look more like Socrates under the tree in the agora. But so but it's certainly a process where you're teaching how to understand Latin grammar, the structures of grammar, or the structures of how to be a rhetorician. What are the steps? Okay, so so that's all part of this, because he's talking to freshmen at a commencement lecture where the year is commencing at Cambridge. And in a sense, as I say, he's advertising his course. Okay, He's also advertising the fact, because he's coming out of Ramus, that he's part of the, well, not a Puritan himself. He's part of the Puritan intellectual class at Cambridge, which he's letting the Puritan students know, yeah, come see me, I'm okay. Okay. So, so yeah, this is all formal. So no Montessori here.
Since I've had to like do some homeschooling with my son, he's 5 and he goes to the Montessori school in Homa, and I've just noticed like working with his teacher and working with more of the philosophies, I'm reading this through that perspective.
Right. Good.
So is that okay
Well,
to include that in the gloss?
Sure.
As
You,
we could
yeah,
include that in the
bring that,
gloss?
yeah, bring your ideas in. I don't mean to negate
No,
them.
no, it's fine. It's discussion.
But,
It's good. It's
but
part of the
also
curriculum.
understand that Montessori is highly methodized. It's got its very distinct process. I had 2 children go through Montessori, and I used to get into debates with their Montessori teacher. So yeah, I mean, Montessori is not organic schooling. So you're going through those children are going through a very specific way of learning. Okay. Sometimes Montessori gets confused with organic learning, which is more free time all the time. But the free time is methodized. You're expected to do this and do this with these apparatuses. Because Montessori originally designed her curriculum for learning disabled students. It was never meant for middle class. Anyway, and we can talk more about that at some other time. Anything else? All right. Well, thank y'all for your questions. And
Thank you.
let me see.
Say bye.
Pretty sure I'm recording. Good. So it will take a little while, but I'll get this generated and put up on Moodle. All right. We all have a wonderful evening.
Thank
I will be doing, I do plan to do this again next week for the Quest for Method. Okay? Great. Y'all take care.